A house don't sing lullabies unless it's already been claimed, the old man at the land office had muttered, but Ethan Cole hadn't believed a word of it when he paid $2,000 in cash for a ranch no one else wanted, 30 acres of dry land, a half-burned barn, and a main house that leaned just enough to whisper trouble in the wind. He signed the paper with a steady hand and rode out before sundown. Dust trailing behind his horse like a past he didn't care to look back on. By the time he reached the property, the sky was turning that deep copper color that sits low over the plains, the kind that makes everything feel older than it is. The air smelled of dry grass and old smoke, like something had ended here but never truly left. Ethan dismounted slow, boots hitting dirt that hadn't seen footprints in weeks, maybe months. The fence posts creaked softly, loose wire tapping in the wind, and the house stood ahead of him. Quiet, empty, just the way he wanted it. No voices, no memories, no questions. He pushed the front door open and it groaned like it had something to say, but thought better of it. Inside was dust, thick and settled, the kind that tells you no one's been there long enough for the past to go cold. A wooden table sat in the corner, one leg slightly shorter than the others, rocking faintly when the wind slipped through the cracks. He walked room to room, slow, measured, his hand brushing against walls that still held the faint smell of burned timber. The bedrooms were bare, closets empty, no clothes, no blankets, no sign of life, just space, just silence. Exactly what he paid for. He checked the back door, bolted it from the inside, then the windows, one by one, making sure each one held, his movements careful, practiced, like a man who had learned that peace had to be secured, not given. When he was done, he stepped back into the main room, set his saddlebag down near the wall, and lit a small oil lamp. The flame flickered low, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like they didn't belong to anything solid. He sat for a moment, listening, nothing but wind, nothing but the soft creak of wood settling into night. And then he heard it, faint, almost lost between the boards and the breeze, a sound that didn't belong to empty places, a baby crying, soft at first, like it was trying not to be heard. Ethan didn't move right away, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting near his belt but not drawing anything. He listened again, and there it was, clearer now, a small, steady cry coming from somewhere deeper in the house. He stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor in a way that felt too loud, too sharp. The cry stopped for a second, then came back, and with it, something else, a voice, low, soft, singing in a language he didn't understand. The melody carried through the walls like it had always been there, like the house itself remembered it. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had checked every room, every corner. There was no one here. He knew that. He had made sure of it. Step by step he moved down the narrow hallway, the lamp in his hand casting a dim glow that barely reached the floor ahead of him. The sound led him to the last door at the end, the one he had closed himself, the one he had tested twice to make sure it latched right. Now it stood just slightly open, not enough to see through, just enough to say it had moved. The crying grew louder as he approached, his boots slow against the wood. Each step measured, controlled. He stopped just short of the door. The singing stopped. The baby quieted, and for a moment the house held its breath. Ethan reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the door, and pushed it open just enough for the light to slip inside. Shapes formed in the dim, not empty, not quiet, for figures standing still in the shadows, and one of them holding something small, wrapped, breathing, alive. Ethan didn't speak, didn't reach for anything. He just stood there, staring into a room he knew had been empty, and somewhere behind him, far out beyond the fence line, the wind carried a different sound now, distant, steady, like hooves touching dirt one after another, coming closer, not fast, not loud, just enough to be heard by a man who had learned how to listen. Ethan didn't turn around, not yet. His eyes stayed on the figures in front of him, and for the first time since he bought the land, he understood something simple and cold. The ranch wasn't empty. It never had been, and whatever he had just walked into wasn't waiting for him. It had been waiting for something else. The woman holding the baby stepped forward first, not fast, not slow, just enough for the lamplight to touch her face. Her eyes steady, dark, not afraid, not welcoming either, something in between, something older than the moment itself. Ethan felt it before. He understood it, the weight of being measured, not as a threat, not as a savior, just as a man standing where he did not belong. The other 3 women stayed behind her, silent, their outlines barely shifting as the light moved. The baby stirred in her arms, a soft breath, then quiet again. As if even the child knew this was not a place for noise, Ethan lowered the lamp slightly, the flame dipping, shadows growing longer across the walls. "I checked this room," he said, his voice even, controlled, not accusing, not confused, just stating what he knew. The woman did not answer right away. She looked at the door, then at the floor, then back at him, as if choosing what truth to give and what to leave behind. "You checked what you could see," she said finally, her English careful, each word placed with intention. Ethan let that sit for a moment, the kind of answer that did not argue, but did not agree either. Behind him, the faint sound of hooves came again, a little clearer now, still distant, but real, not imagination, not wind. He turned his head slightly, just enough to listen, then looked back at her. "You have people coming," he said, not a question. She nodded once, small, certain. "Not ours," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls had leaned into here. Ethan glanced at the others, one older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands folded in front of her like she had already made peace with whatever came next. Another younger, her shoulders tense, watching him with the sharp focus of someone who had learned not to trust quickly. The third stood near the back wall, one hand resting lightly against it, as if grounding herself to the place. None of them spoke. None of them moved forward. Only the woman with the child held the space between them. "You are Apache," Ethan said, not as a challenge, not as a label, just as recognition. The woman's eyes did not change, but something behind them shifted, like a door opening just a fraction. "And you are standing in a house you believe you bought," she answered. Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was true. In a way he had not expected. He looked down briefly, then back up. "I paid for the land this morning," he said. $2,000, paper signed in town." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him again. "Paper does not remember what happened here," she said, and for a moment, the wind outside pushed harder against the walls, a low sound through the cracks, like something agreeing with her. Ethan stepped back half a pace, not retreating, just giving the room more air, more space. His hand moved away from his belt completely now, open, empty. He set the lamp on a small table near the door, the light steadier there, less movement. "I am not here to force anyone out," he said, "but I need to understand what I walked into." The woman looked at the child, adjusting the cloth slightly, then back at him. "You walked into something that has not ended," she said. "We did not come here to hide from you." She paused, just long enough for the next words to carry weight. "We stayed because leaving would mean losing what is left." Ethan felt that settle deeper than he expected, the kind of sentence that did not explain everything, but explained enough. Outside, the hoofbeats came again, closer now, enough to count if a man listened carefully. 3, then another, not a large group yet, but growing. The younger woman near the back shifted her stance, her eyes flicking toward the window, then back to Ethan, measuring him again, this time not just as a stranger, but as a variable, something that could change what happened next. Ethan noticed it, the way attention moved when pressure came from outside. He turned slightly toward the hallway, then stopped, looking back at them. "How many are coming?" he asked. The older woman spoke this time, her voice low, steady. "Enough to make men leave," she said. No fear in it, just fact. Ethan nodded once, slow, absorbing that. Then he looked at the door, then at the walls, the burned beams, the dust that had not settled by accident, the quiet that was not empty but waiting. He understood something then, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel it in his chest. This place had been claimed long before he rode in with a saddlebag and a receipt, and whatever had happened here had drawn a line that paper could not erase. He turned back to the woman holding the child. "What is his name?" he asked. The question simple, but it changed something in the room. The woman blinked once, surprised not by the question, but by its timing. She looked down at the baby, her expression softening just a fraction. "Tawa," she said, then lifted her eyes to meet his again. "It means son." Ethan nodded, the faintest movement, then He looked toward the window as the sound of hooves reached the edge of the property. Closer now, no longer distant, no longer something that could be ignored. And for the first time since stepping into the house, he did not think about the money he paid, or the silence he came here to find. He thought about a child named after the sun, in a place that still carried the shadow of something unfinished, and the choice that was already beginning to take shape before anyone said it out loud. The first rider reached the fence line without slowing, his horse stepping through the loose wire as if it had done it before. The others followed in a quiet line, not rushed, not uncertain, just deliberate, like men who already knew where they were and what they had come for. Ethan stood in the doorway now, the lamplight behind him casting his shadow long across the dry ground. He did not step forward, did not reach for anything. He just watched, counting without moving his lips. 1, 3, 7. Then more shapes forming behind them in the fading light. Not a large group, but enough to change the air, enough to make silence feel heavy. The lead rider brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet from the porch, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to show he did not need to come closer. His hat sat low, shadowing his eyes, but his posture carried authority, the kind that does not ask for attention, it takes it. Ethan noticed the small details, the way the man held the reins loose but controlled, the way the others spaced themselves without needing direction. This was not a group of wanderers. This was purpose. The man lifted his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry. "You bought this place today," he said, not a question. Ethan nodded once, slow. "I did," he answered, his tone steady. The man's gaze shifted briefly past Ethan, toward the open doorway, toward the dim light inside, then back again. "Then you bought more than you were told," he said, and there was no edge in it, no threat, just a statement laid flat like a card on a table. Behind Ethan, the house remained still, but he could feel the presence of the women, not moving, not speaking, waiting, not for him, but for what he would do. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the doorframe, grounding himself to something solid. "If you have business here," he said, "you can speak it plain." The man on the horse studied him for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, like he had expected resistance and found something else instead. "We are not here for you," he said, "but you are standing in the way." Ethan let that settle, not reacting, not stepping aside, just listening. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dust and horse sweat, and something else, something older, something that seemed to rise from the land itself. The man continued, "There are people in that house who do not belong to you." Ethan almost smiled again at the phrasing, but he kept it inside. "Nothing in that house belongs to me," he replied. "Not yet." The rider's head tilted slightly, a small movement, but it changed the weight of the moment, as if the answer had not gone where he expected. One of the men behind him shifted in the saddle, not impatient, just adjusting, the quiet kind of movement that still said something was building. Ethan glanced back once, just a fraction, enough to confirm what he already knew. The women had not moved. The child had not cried again. The stillness inside the house held, like a line drawn in the dust. He turned back to the riders. "You said you are not here for me," Ethan said. "So say what you came for." The lead rider held his gaze, then nodded once, small, controlled. "We came for the child," he said. Simple, direct, no decoration. The words settled between them like something that had been waiting to be spoken. Ethan felt the shift. Immediately, not in the air, but in himself, the way choices begin to take shape before they are named. He did not answer right away, did not turn, did not look back. He just stood there, eyes steady. The man on the horse continued. "That child carries something that does not stay hidden," he said. "And there are people who will not leave it to chance." Ethan heard the words, but he also heard what was not being said, the weight behind them, the reason behind the quiet approach instead of force. This was not chaos. This was control, the kind that comes from knowing more than you explain. "And you," Ethan said slowly, "you are here to take him away from that." The rider's expression did not change, but his voice softened just enough to notice. "We are here to make sure he is not taken by the wrong hands." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, measuring, not the words, but the man behind them. Then he asked, "And who decides which hands are wrong?" The question hung there, Not sharp, not accusing, just honest. The rider did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted once more toward the house, then back to Ethan. "That is why we came before the others," he said, and for the first time, something like urgency touched the edge of his voice. Not panic, not fear, just time pressing in from all sides. Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand still resting on the frame, the wood warm from the lamp behind him. He thought about the paper he had signed, the land he had claimed, the silence he had come here to find, and the child inside, wrapped in worn cloth, breathing softly in a place that did not forget. The sound of more hooves carried faintly from farther. Out now, not close yet, but coming. And whatever this moment was, it was not going to wait. Ethan straightened just slightly. Not a challenge, not a retreat, just a man deciding where he stood. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it did not move. "No one takes that child tonight," he said. And the wind, for just a second, seemed to stop and listen. The words settled into the space between them like dust that refused to rise again. No one moved. Not the riders, not the women inside, not even the wind that had been whispering through the broken fence moments before. The lead rider studied Ethan with a different kind of attention now, not measuring distance or threat, but something quieter, something closer to understanding. "You do not know what you are standing in front of," he said, his voice low. Not a warning, not quite advice. Ethan did not look away. "I know enough," he replied. "A child inside that house does not belong in the hands of men who arrive at dusk and speak in halves." One of the riders behind shifted again, a slight movement of leather and breath, but the lead man raised a hand just enough to still it, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "If we wanted to take him," he said, "we would not be talking." There was no threat in the sentence, just truth laid plain, and that was what made it heavier. Ethan nodded once, accepting the weight of it without stepping aside. "Then keep talking," he said. Behind him, the floor creaked softly, not from movement, but from presence, the kind that filled space without sound. Ethan could feel them closer now. The women, not hiding, not retreating, standing just behind the line of the doorway, not crossing it, not needing to. The lead rider exhaled slowly, like a man choosing what to carry forward and what to leave unsaid. "The child's father was not meant to be remembered by men like us," he said, "but he is remembered by those who fear what comes after him." Ethan listened, the words not fully explained, but enough to paint a shape. "And the child?" Ethan asked. "What is he to you?" The rider paused, just a fraction, then answered, "A responsibility." The word landed differently than the others, softer, but heavier. Ethan glanced briefly toward the horizon, the last line of light fading behind distant hills, and in that dimming space he saw it, faint shapes further out, more riders, not yet close, but not far either, a second group, or maybe more, moving in a different rhythm, less measured, less patient. Time was tightening now, pulling everything inward. Ethan turned back, his voice quieter than before, but steadier. "You said you came before the others," he said, "so you know they will not ask." The rider nodded once. "They will not." Ethan let that settle, then shifted his weight slightly, not stepping back, not forward, just enough to show he was still there, still choosing. "Then you also know I cannot hand him over," he said. The rider's gaze softened again, not in agreement, but in recognition of something he had expected and still needed to hear. "You think this is about right and wrong," the man said. "It is not." Ethan almost answered, but stopped himself, listening instead. "It is about what survives when men like us make choices that do not belong to us." The words lingered, carried by something older than the moment, something tied to the land beneath them. Ethan looked down for a second, the dirt beneath his boots dry, cracked, but holding, then back up again. "Then maybe it is time someone stands where they are not supposed to," he said, behind him, a soft sound. Not a cry, not fear, just the faintest shift of cloth, the baby stirring, reminding the world of his presence without asking anything from it. The lead rider closed his eyes briefly, just a second, then opened them again, the decision already forming. "If we stay," he said, "we stand with you." The words came without hesitation now, clear, final. Ethan did not react outwardly, but something in his shoulders settled, not relief, not victory, just alignment. "And if you leave," Ethan asked. The rider looked past him once more, toward the house, toward what remained inside. Then they will not stop at the door, he said. Simple, direct, no space left between meaning and consequence. Ethan nodded, once slow, then stepped back half a pace, turning just enough to glance into the house. The lamplight catching the edge of Ayana's face, her eyes steady, watching, not asking, not pleading, just present. He held that for a moment, then turned back to the riders. Then we do not leave, he said. The lead man inclined his head slightly, not as submission, but as agreement between men who had chosen the same ground. Behind him, the others shifted, subtle, controlled, their horses adjusting as if they understood the change before it was spoken. The distant riders on the horizon grew clearer now, more defined, moving faster, less patient, the space between moments shrinking. Ethan stepped fully onto the porch, the wood firm beneath his boots, the house behind him no longer empty. Not his, not theirs, but something shared in that instant. The wind returned, low and steady, carrying dust across the yard, and with it came the feeling that whatever had been waiting here had finally found its shape. Not in ownership, not in paper, but in the quiet line of people who chose to stand and not move when the rest of the world expected them to step aside. The second group did not slow when they reached the edge of the property, their horses cutting through the dry grass in a line that felt less like arrival and more like interruption. They did not spread out the way the first riders had. They came tighter, closer together, like men who trusted numbers more than silence. Ethan watched them from the porch, his shoulders still, his hands empty, the lamplight behind him casting a steady glow that did not flicker now, as if the house itself had decided to hold its breath. The lead rider beside Ethan shifted his weight slightly in the saddle, not turning away, not backing down, just adjusting to what was coming. These are not men who wait, he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching line. Ethan nodded once. I can see that, he answered. The sound of hooves grew louder, heavier, until the ground itself seemed to carry the rhythm, and then they stopped, not far, maybe 15 yards out, close enough for faces to be seen, for intentions to be read without words. The man at their front leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his eyes sharp, scanning the porch, the riders beside Ethan, then the open doorway behind him, taking in everything in a single breath. Step aside, he said, his voice cutting through the air without needing volume. Ethan did not move, did not answer right away. The wind shifted again, brushing dust along the porch steps. The man's gaze hardened just enough to notice. We are not here for you, he added, echoing the words spoken before, but carrying a different weight. Less patience, more certainty. Ethan rested his hand against the wooden post beside him, grounding himself again. That has already been said, he replied, calm, even. The man's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition that this would not be simple. One of his men leaned closer, murmuring something too low to catch, but the leader raised a hand, silencing it without looking, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Then you understand this does not concern you, he said. It concerns the child. The word landed heavier now, spoken from a different place, not responsibility, not protection, but claim. Ethan felt the difference immediately. The line between the two groups no longer just distance, but intent. Behind him, the faintest shift again, not fear, not retreat, just awareness. The women inside listening without stepping forward, holding their place as if it mattered more than anything else. Ethan glanced once toward the first rider beside him, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The man had not moved, had not reconsidered. The choice had been made. Ethan turned back, his voice quieter now, but firmer. You will not take him from this house, he said, not raising his tone, not forcing it, just placing it there like something that would not be moved. The second group's leader studied him for a long moment, the kind that stretches without breaking. Then he exhaled slowly, almost a laugh, but without humor. You bought a piece of land this morning, he said, and by nightfall you think you understand what stands on it. Ethan did not react to the words, only listened. The man continued, that child does not belong to you, does not belong to them. He gestured slightly toward the house. He belongs to something larger than any of us standing here. Ethan let the sentence settle, then asked quietly. And you are the one to decide that. The man's expression shifted, not anger, not offense, just a tightening of something deeper. I am the one who will not let him be hidden, he answered. And there it was, clear now, the difference in purpose laid bare without raising a voice. Ethan nodded once, understanding more in that moment than had been explained in all the words before. The first rider beside him spoke then, his voice low but carrying. There are ways to protect without taking, he said. The second leader turned his head slightly, acknowledging him for the first time. And there are ways to lose everything by waiting, he replied. Neither man raised his tone, neither stepped forward, but the space between them grew tighter, heavier. Ethan stood in the middle of it, not as a barrier, not as a bridge, just as a man who had chosen where he would remain. The baby stirred again inside, a soft sound, not crying, just breathing, alive, present, undeniable. And for a brief second, every man there heard it, and something shifted, not in movement, but in meaning. Ethan looked toward the doorway, then back at the men in front of him. He is not something to be moved like property, Ethan said, his voice steady. The second leader's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in calculation. Everything is moved when it needs to survive, he said. Ethan shook his head once, slow. Not everything, he replied. The wind passed through again, stronger now, lifting dust across the yard, blurring the lines between boots and hooves and earth. And in that shifting haze, the moment held, stretched thin between decision and consequence. No one reached for anything, no one stepped forward, but everyone understood that what happened next would not be undone. Ethan straightened just slightly, his stance unchanged, his voice quieter than before, almost lost to the wind but still heard. You came to take him, he said. We are here to make sure you do not. And for the first time, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt chosen. No one spoke for a long moment after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word now carried weight that could not be taken back. The second group's leader shifted slightly in his saddle, not forward, not back, just enough to let the leather creak and remind everyone that time was still moving. Even if they were not, his eyes moved past Ethan again, toward the doorway, toward the dim glow where shadows held their shape. You think standing there changes what is coming, he said, quieter now, not less certain, just more focused. Ethan did not turn, did not follow his gaze. No, he answered. But it changes what happens when it gets here. The man studied him again, longer this time, as if trying to place something that did not fit the pattern he expected. Behind Ethan, the floor creaked once, and this time it was movement. Ayanna stepped into the edge of the doorway, not fully outside, not hidden either. The lamplight caught her face, calm, steady. The child still in her arms, the cloth wrapped close. She did not speak at first. She just stood there, present, undeniable, and every man on horseback felt the shift, not in threat, but in meaning. The second leader's gaze fixed on her, something tightening behind his eyes, not recognition, but awareness. You should not be here, he said, not harsh, not soft, just certain. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, the same measured movement she had used before. We have always been here, she replied, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. The words did not challenge. They did not argue. They simply existed, and that made them harder to push aside. The man exhaled slowly, like someone hearing a truth he did not intend to accept. This place is no longer yours, he said. Ayanna's eyes did not change. It was never yours to give away, she answered. Ethan felt that land between them again, not just dirt and dust, but something deeper, something that had been spoken over too many times and never settled. The first rider beside him spoke again, his voice lower now, but firm. We do not have time for this, he said. More are coming. The second leader nodded once, acknowledging it without turning. That is why we finish this now, he said, his tone sharpening just enough to cut through the stillness. Ethan stepped half a pace forward, placing himself more clearly between the porch and the yard, not blocking, not advancing, just defining the line. No one finishes anything here tonight, he said. Ayanna did not move behind him, but her presence held, the child quiet in her arms, the weight of his small breathing somehow filling the space more than any raised voice could. The second leader looked at Ethan, then at the men beside him, then back again, calculating, measuring, not just numbers, but resolve. You are asking for something you cannot hold, he said. Ethan shook his head once slow. I am not asking, he replied. The wind shifted again, stronger now, pulling dust into the air, softening the edges of everything. The riders, the house, the lines drawn between them. For a moment it felt like the land itself was watching, waiting to see who would claim it without speaking. Ayanna took one small step forward, just enough for the light to reach the child's face, not fully visible, but enough to show life, warmth, presence. She looked at the second leader, not defiant, not pleading, just steady. He is not something you can carry away from what he is, she said. The man's gaze dropped briefly to the child, then lifted again. Everything can be carried, he answered, but the certainty in his voice had shifted, just a fraction. Ethan noticed it. The way conviction bends when it meets something it cannot easily define. The first rider beside him leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough for Ethan but not for the others. He will not leave without trying, he said. Ethan nodded once, not looking at him. Neither will we, he answered. The distant sound of more hooves grew clearer now, no longer faint, no longer uncertain. Another group, or perhaps more than one, drawn by the same purpose, but not the same intention. The second leader heard it too, his jaw tightening slightly. Time was no longer wide. It was narrowing, closing in from all sides. He looked at Ethan one last time, then at Ayanna, then at the child, and something passed through his expression, not doubt, not surrender, but something close to recognition of a moment that would not bend easily. This does not end here, he said, not as a threat, but as a fact carried forward. Ethan held his gaze, unshaken. Then it begins here, he replied, and for a brief second, the wind fell still again, the dust settling just enough for everything to come into focus. The house behind him, no longer empty, the riders before him, no longer strangers, and the land beneath all of them, holding its silence like it had done for years, waiting for someone to stand on it and mean it. The horizon did not hold still anymore. What had once been a distant line of movement now broke into shapes, riders separating from dust, outlines forming with intention that no longer hid itself. Ethan could see them clearly now, not one group, not two, but many threads pulling toward the same place, some fast, some cautious, none of them turning away. The land that had stayed quiet for so long was now calling people back to it, not with words, but with memory. The second leader noticed it first, his eyes flicking past Ethan again, counting without speaking. His posture changed, not fear, not retreat, but urgency pressed into stillness. You see it now, he said, quieter than before. Ethan nodded once. I do, he answered, and in that moment something settled between them, not agreement, but recognition that whatever came next would not belong to any one man. Ayanna stepped fully into the doorway then, no longer held by the edge of shadow, the lamplight behind her steady, the child in her arms breathing softly against her chest. She did not look at Ethan this time. She looked at the land, at the riders coming from every direction, and her voice carried low but certain. They remember this place, she said. The words were not for one man, not for one group, but for all of them standing there. The first rider beside Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again. It was not meant to be remembered like this, he said, almost to himself. The second leader shifted again, his control still present, but thinner now, stretched by the reality unfolding in front of him. Memory does not ask permission, he replied, and there was something in that sentence that stripped the moment down to something raw and simple. The truth that no one here had created what was happening. They had only arrived inside it. Ethan stepped down from the porch slowly, one step, then another, his boots meeting the dirt with quiet certainty. He did not move toward one side or the other. He moved to where the space between them felt equal, where no one could claim he stood behind or ahead, just present. The wind moved again, carrying the scent of more horses, more people, more intent, and for the first time, the riders who had arrived earlier shifted not as individuals, but as a group, their spacing changing, their lines adjusting, not to advance, not to withdraw, but to hold. Ethan noticed it. The way men moved when they understood something larger than their own purpose had arrived. Ayanna stepped forward as well, not to stand beside Ethan, not to stand behind him, but to stand in her own place. The child still quiet in her arms, her presence not demanding space, but defining it. The second leader watched her closely now. Something in his expression no longer hard, no longer certain, but searching. "You knew this would happen," he said, not accusing, just trying to place the shape of it. Ayanna did not hesitate. "No," she answered, "but I knew it had not ended." The words moved through the space like wind through dry grass, touching everything without stopping anywhere. Ethan looked from her to the riders, then back again, and in that moment he understood something that had not been spoken. This was never about taking the child, never about the land on paper. It was about something left unfinished, something carried forward without being named. The first rider beside him spoke again. "If they all come," he said, "there will be no space for choices." Ethan shook his head slowly. "There is always space," he replied, "just not for long." The second leader let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but it carried no humor. "You speak like a man who believes he can hold a storm in place," he said. Ethan looked at him, steady. "No," he answered, "just a man who knows when to stand in it." The sound of hooves reached the outer fence now, not one line, not one rhythm, but many, overlapping, converging. The land that had been empty hours ago now filled with presence, with history pressing forward into the present, and no one moved to meet it. No one stepped away. They all held, not because they had agreed, but because something deeper than agreement had taken hold. Ayanna lowered her gaze to the child for a brief moment, then lifted it again. Her voice softer now, but clearer than anything spoken before. "He does not belong to any of you," she said. The second leader did not answer. The first rider did not answer. Ethan did not answer, because the truth of it had already settled, and in the distance, as the next wave of riders crossed into the land, the wind carried something else with it. Not sound, not movement, but the feeling that whatever had been buried here was no longer willing to stay beneath the surface. And every man standing there knew, without needing to say it, that this was no longer about who would take the child, but about who would remain when the land decided to speak. The first of the new riders did not stop at the fence. He slowed just enough to show he chose to, then brought his horse forward into the open space, not claiming it, not yielding it either, just entering it like a man stepping into a place he already knew. The others behind him spread wider than the groups before, not tight, not loose, but deliberate, forming a half circle that did not close, as if they were not here to trap anyone, but to witness something that had already begun. Ethan felt the shift immediately. This was not the same purpose that had ridden in before, not taking, not protecting, something else, something quieter. The lead rider removed his hat slowly, not as a gesture to any man, but to the land itself, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined not by age alone, but by memory carried too long. He looked first at Ayanna, then at the child, and only after that at the men on either side of Ethan. "It has been many seasons," he said, his voice low, steady, not raised, but it carried across the yard as if the air itself made room for it. No one answered right away, not the first group, not the second, not Ethan. The silence that followed was not empty. It was listening. Ayanna stepped forward one more pace, her eyes holding the man's. "Too many," she replied. The words simple, but they carried something deeper than time. The man nodded once, a slow acknowledgement, not agreement, not apology, just recognition. He looked around the land, the broken fence, the burned wood, the house that stood not empty but waiting. "And still," he said quietly, "remembers." Ethan watched him carefully. This man did not carry urgency like the others, did not carry claim or warning. He carried something heavier, something that did not move quickly because it did not need to. The second leader shifted in his saddle, impatience pressing against restraint. "We do not have time for this," he said, sharper now. "Say what you came for." The older man turned his gaze to him, not slowly, not sharply, just enough. "I came because it was called," he said. The answer did not explain anything, and yet it did not need to. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying dust in a slow spiral between them. The first rider beside Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, then raised them again. "Then you know what is at stake," he said. The older man nodded. "I know what was never finished," he replied. Ethan felt something settle deeper in his chest. The words connecting to something he had sensed but could not name. The land, the house, the silence that had never been empty. It had all been waiting for this moment to surface. The second leader leaned forward slightly, his patience thinning. "The child cannot stay here," he said. "Not when others are already coming." The older man did not look at him this time. His gaze remained on Ayanna and the child. "The child has already stayed," he said, "longer than any of us understood." The statement landed differently than the others. Not an argument, not a position, but a truth that did not bend. Ayanna lowered her gaze to the child for a moment, her hand adjusting the cloth gently, then lifted her eyes again. "He was born on this land," she said, her voice steady. The words carried through the air like something finally spoken aloud after being held too long. Ethan felt it then, the final piece settling into place. This was not a place they had come to. This was a place they had returned to, and the child was not a reason. He was the result. The second leader's expression tightened, not in disbelief, but in resistance to something that complicated what had been simple before. "Then that makes it worse," he said, "not better." The older man finally turned his gaze to him fully, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that held weight beyond calm. Not anger, not force, but something that asked to be understood. "It makes it true," he said. The words did not rise. They did not press. They simply stood, and for a moment, no one answered. The wind moved again. The horses shifted. The land held. Ethan stepped slightly to the side, not away, not toward, just enough to see all of them at once. The two groups who came to act, and the third that came to remember, and behind him, the house that had never been empty. He looked at the older man, then at Ayanna, then at the child, and something inside him settled into place. Not confusion, not doubt, but clarity without comfort. The older man spoke again, softer now, but no less certain. "You cannot carry him away from what he is," he said, his gaze moving between the men on horseback. "And you cannot leave him here without understanding why." The second leader did not respond immediately. The first rider beside Ethan did not move. Ayanna stood steady, and the child breathed softly in her arms. And in that stillness, the land itself seemed to wait, not for a decision, but for someone to understand that the decision had already been made long before any of them arrived. No one rushed to answer after that, not because the words had ended, but because something deeper had taken their place, something that did not need language to hold it together. The older man's gaze remained steady on the child, not possessive, not distant, just present, as if he had seen this moment long before it arrived. Ethan felt it too, the shift from argument to understanding, not complete, not comfortable, but real. The second leader drew in a slow breath, his shoulders tightening slightly as if carrying a weight he could not set down. "Understanding does not change what must be done," he said, his voice lower now, less sharp, but still firm. The older man did not argue. He only nodded once. "No," he said, "but it changes how it is done." The difference between the two statements hung in the air like two paths that would never fully meet. Ethan looked between them, then back toward Ayanna, who had not moved, her arms steady around the child, her presence unbroken. She did not look at the riders now. She looked at the land, the horizon, the gathering figures that had turned this quiet place into something alive again. "They will not stop coming," she said softly, not to anyone in particular, but to all of them. The first rider beside Ethan answered this time, his voice calm. "No," he said, "they will not." The truth of it did not carry fear, only inevitability. The sound of more horses filled the edges of the space, not close enough to crowd, but close enough to remind every man there that this moment was not theirs alone. The second leader leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but pressed by time. "Then we decide now," he said, "before this becomes something none of us can guide." Ethan stepped forward one pace, not to confront, not to command, just to be heard without raising his voice. "It already is," he said, and the words landed with quiet certainty. The older man glanced at him, something like approval passing through his eyes. not for the statement itself, but for the understanding behind it. The second leader looked at Ethan for a long moment, then at Ayanna, then at the child, and for the first time his gaze lingered there, not calculating, not measuring, but seeing, really seeing, the small rise and fall of breath, the stillness that held life without asking anything from it. If he stays, the second leader said slowly, others will come not to take, but to claim, and they will. Not ask the way we have. Ethan nodded. He already knew that, had known it the moment the second line of riders appeared on the horizon. And if he leaves, Ethan asked quietly, what becomes of what he was born into? The question did not challenge. It did not accuse. It simply placed the other side of the weight where it belonged. The second leader did not answer right away, his silence stretching longer than any of his words had. The older man spoke instead. If he leaves without understanding, he said, he will spend his life being carried by men who never ask why. The words moved through the space with a different kind of gravity, not pushing, not pulling, just settling where they needed to. Ayanna lowered her head slightly, her voice softer now, but clearer than before. He will not leave without knowing, she said. And there was something in that statement that closed a door no one had noticed was open. The second leader exhaled again, slower this time, his posture easing just enough to show something had shifted, not surrender, not agreement, but the recognition that the choice he came to make had changed shape. The first rider beside Ethan spoke quietly. Then we hold this place, he said, not as an order, not as a plea, but as a fact that had already begun to take form. Ethan looked around then, really looked, at the riders who had come with different purposes, now standing in the same dust, under the same fading light, at the house behind him that was no longer silent, but not loud either, just present. He understood then that the land was not asking for ownership, it was asking for witness, for someone to stand long enough to see it for what it was, not what it had been written to be. The second leader finally nodded, once, slow, deliberate. Then we do not take him, he said, the words measured, chosen, but we do not leave him unguarded. Ethan met his gaze. No one here is unguarded, he replied. The older man inclined his head slightly, the faintest gesture of agreement, and in that moment, something settled, not peace, not resolution, but a shared understanding that this place, this child, this moment, would not be decided by force or silence. Alone, the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the sound of distant riders who had not yet arrived. And as the last light faded from the sky, the figures on the land did not scatter, did not retreat. They remained, not because they had to, but because something within them had chosen to stay, and that choice, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything that had been spoken since the first hoof touched the edge of the property. The night settled fully over the land, not sudden, not heavy, but slow and certain, like something that had always known it would return. The last line of light faded behind the hills, leaving only the soft glow from Ethan's lamp spilling out of the doorway, and the faint outlines of men and horses standing in a quiet that no longer felt empty. No one moved to leave. No one spoke to break what had formed between them. The decision had been made without force, without command, and now it had to be held, not declared. Ethan stepped back onto the porch, not retreating, just returning to the place where the light met the dark, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe again, grounding himself in something real, something that did not shift with words. Behind him, Ayanna moved slightly, adjusting the child in her arms, the soft sound of cloth brushing against cloth carrying more meaning than any voice could. The baby stirred, then settled again, his breathing steady, as if the stillness around him was something he already understood. Ethan glanced back once, just enough to see that they were still there, still steady, still choosing. Then he turned forward again. The riders remained where they had settled. The first group near him, the second spread, wider now, less rigid than before, and the third, the older man and those with him, holding a quiet distance that felt less like separation and more like respect. The land between them no longer divided, just shared. The second leader shifted in his saddle, his voice lower now, carrying less urgency and more weight. We will need to mark this place, he said, not as a demand, but as a necessity that had grown out of what they had chosen. Ethan looked at him. Mark it how? He asked the man. considered for a moment, then answered, "So that those who come next understand before they arrive what stands here." The older man nodded slowly. "Not a warning," he added. "A memory," the word settled into. The air with a different kind of permanence. Ethan looked out across the land, the broken fence, the dry ground, the house that stood behind him, and he understood what they meant. Not ownership, not control, but acknowledgement, something that could not be erased by paper or passed from one hand to another. Then it should not be done by one man. Ethan said quietly. The first rider beside him nodded. "No," he said. "It should be done by all who stand here." The second leader exhaled slowly, something in his posture easing, not because the weight had lifted, but because it had found its place. "Then we begin before the others arrive," he said, and for the first time since the riders had come, there was movement that did not carry tension. The men shifted from their saddles, some dismounting, some stepping down to the ground, not rushing, not cautious, just deliberate, the sound of boots meeting dirt, of reins being held loosely, of horses settling into stillness, all of it blending into something that felt less like preparation and more like recognition. Ethan stepped off the porch again, moving toward the center of the yard, not leading, not following, just present among them. Ayana stepped out as well, the child still in her arms, her presence no longer held by the doorway, but part of the space itself. The older man moved closer then, not fast, not slow, stopping a few feet from Ethan and Ayana, his eyes resting on the child once more, then lifting to meet Ethan's. "You did not come here for this," he said, not a question. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he answered. The man inclined his head just enough to acknowledge that. "And yet you are here," he said. Ethan looked at the land again, then back at him. "So are you," he replied. The man allowed the faintest trace of something like a smile, not amusement, but understanding. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the distant sound of more riders still approaching, but slower, more cautious, as if something about the place ahead had already begun to reach them. The second leader turned slightly, looking toward the horizon, then back at the group. "They will see us standing together," he said. "And they will hesitate," the first rider beside Ethan answered. "That is enough," the older man added quietly. "Sometimes hesitation is the only space truth needs." The words settled into the ground as if they belonged there. Ethan stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had led him here, the land he thought he had bought, the silence he thought he wanted, and the truth that had been waiting beneath it all. He did not speak again. He did not need to, because the line had already been drawn, not in dirt, not in wood, but in the choice to remain. And as the figures on the horizon slowed, their shapes less certain, their movement less direct, the land held that choice quietly, without announcement, without claim, just present, just real. And for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan understood that what he had found here was not something to own, not something to fix, but something to stand beside. And in that understanding, the night did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete. They did not light a fire, not because they could not, but because no one wanted to break the shape the night had taken. The lamp at the doorway was enough, its glow steady against the dark, casting long, quiet shadows that stretched across the yard where men now stood on the same ground, without stepping on each other's purpose. Ethan noticed how the space had changed, not smaller, not larger, but clearer, like something that had been blurred was now set into focus. The older man moved first, not in command, not in ceremony, just with the kind of certainty that does not need to be announced. He bent down slowly and pressed his hand against the dirt, not digging, not marking, just resting there as if listening for something beneath it. The others watched, not interrupting, not questioning. Even the second leader held still, his attention no longer divided between urgency and decision, but anchored in what was unfolding. Ayana stepped closer, the child still in her arms, and lowered herself beside the older man, her free hand touching the ground in the same way. Gentle, deliberate, and for a moment nothing else existed but that simple act, two hands on dry earth, holding contact with something unseen. Ethan felt it before he understood it, a shift that did not come from movement or sound, but from recognition, like the land itself answering in silence. The first rider beside him dismounted then, his boots settling into the dirt with a quiet firmness. He did not step forward immediately. He paused, then followed, kneeling on one knee and placing his hand down as well, not copying, not imitating, but joining, one by one. The others followed, not all at once, not rushed, just choosing, stepping down, lowering themselves, touching the ground as if acknowledging something that had been waiting for them to do exactly this. Ethan stood for a moment longer, watching, the weight of the day pressing into him. The purchase, the ride, the voices, the choices, all of it leading to this quiet moment that did not feel like an ending, but a beginning that had no clear direction. He stepped forward then, slow, deliberate, and lowered himself to the ground, his hand hovering just above the dirt for a second before touching it. The surface was dry, rough, warm from the heat of the day, but beneath it there was something steadier, something that did not shift with wind or footsteps. He did not know what he was supposed to feel, but he felt something, not a voice, not a memory, just a sense that this place had not been empty when he arrived, and it was not empty now. The second leader hesitated longer than the others, his posture still upright on the horse, his gaze moving from the men who had already knelt to the house, to Ayanna, to the child. The tension in him did not disappear, but it changed shape, less resistance, more weight. He exhaled slowly, then dismounted, the movement controlled, measured, as if each step carried more than just his own decision. He walked forward and stopped where the others had gathered, looking down at the ground as if seeing it differently than he had before, and after a moment, he bent and placed his hand on the dirt as well, not easily, not naturally, but honestly. The older man lifted his head slightly, his voice low, steady. "It is not the land that needs marking," he said. "It is the memory of those who stand on it." The words moved through the group without force, without demand, settling where they needed to settle. Ethan kept his hand against the ground, feeling the stillness beneath it, the way it held everything without asking anything in return. Ayanna spoke then, her voice soft but clear. "He will know," she said, looking down at the child. "Not because we tell him, but because we stayed." The simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument that had come before. The second leader lifted his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's across the small space between them. There was no challenge in it now, no claim, just understanding. "Then this place stands," he said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "It does," he replied. The older man removed his hand from the ground slowly, brushing the dust from his palm, not as if it were something unwanted, but as if it were something carried, something taken with him. The others followed, rising one by one, not breaking the moment, just moving out of it. The night held steady around them, the distant riders no longer advancing as quickly, their shapes lingering at the edge of the land, as if something about what they saw had changed their approach. No one called out to them. No one raised a voice. The stillness itself spoke enough. Ethan stepped back slightly, looking at the house behind him, then at the people in front of him, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not feel like he was standing between sides. He felt like he was standing within something shared, something that did not belong to him, but had allowed him to remain. And in that quiet understanding, no one needed to say what would come next, because they all knew, not in words, but in the way they stood, that whatever this place had been waiting for, it had finally been met, not with force, not with ownership, but with presence. And that was something no paper, no writer, no passing moment could take away. The night did not end. It softened, the kind of quiet that comes after something important has been understood, not resolved, but accepted. The riders who had lingered at the edges did not press forward anymore. They stayed where they were, distant, shapes against the dark, watching, waiting, but no longer advancing, as if whatever they had come for had already shifted beyond their reach. Ethan stood near the porch again, the lamp still burning behind him, its light no longer the only source of presence, but a reminder that something simple could hold steady when everything else changed. He looked out across the yard where men who had arrived with different intentions now stood, without dividing lines, not speaking, not needing to. The older man stepped away from the place where they had all touched the ground, his movements slow, deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of something he was leaving behind and something he was taking with him. He paused near Ayanna, his gaze resting on the child once more, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. He will grow with this, he said quietly. Ayanna nodded once, her eyes steady. He already has, she replied. The words did not carry pride, only truth. The older man inclined his head slightly, then turned toward his horse, not in retreat, not in departure, but in continuation, as if his part in this moment had reached its place. The first rider who had stood beside Ethan followed soon after, not quickly, not hesitating, his gaze meeting Ethan's for a brief moment, something unspoken passing between them, not agreement, not obligation, just acknowledgement. You stood, he said. Simple, direct. Ethan nodded. So did you, he answered. The man allowed the faintest curve at the edge of his expression, then mounted his horse without another word. The second leader remained where he was a moment longer, his eyes moving across the land, the house, the people, the child, taking it all in as if committing it to memory in a way that could not be written down. He turned his attention back to Ethan, his voice quieter now, stripped of the urgency that had brought him here. This place will not stay quiet, he said. Ethan did not look away. It never was, he replied. The man considered that, then nodded once, a slow acceptance of something he had resisted earlier. Then those who come will have to understand it the same way we did, he said. Ethan shook his head. Slightly. Not the same way, he answered. Their own way. The difference lingered between them, not disagreement, but a recognition that understanding could not be passed from one man to another. It had to be found. The second leader exhaled softly, then turned toward his horse, mounting with the same controlled ease he had shown when he arrived. But now without the edge that had once driven him forward. The groups began to move then, not all at once, not in formation, but in a quiet departure that did not break what had been formed. They rode out in different directions, some toward the hills, some along the dry path that cut through the land, none of them looking back more than once, as if they understood that what had happened here did not need to be watched to remain real. The distant riders who had waited at the edge began to turn as well, their hesitation resolved not by command, but by the absence of conflict. The night reclaimed its space slowly, the sound of hooves fading into distance, leaving behind only the soft movement of wind through the grass and the quiet creak of wood settling again. Ethan stood there as the last of them disappeared into the dark, the yard empty once more, but not the same kind of empty it had been before. He turned back toward the house, the light still warm against the doorway, and stepped inside. Ayanna had not moved far. She stood near the table, the child still in her arms, the other women behind her, their presence calm, no longer hidden, no longer waiting. Just there. Ethan paused for a moment, looking at them, at the space that had changed without being rearranged. Then he walked past them slowly, setting his hand briefly on the back of the chair he had sat in earlier, grounding himself again in something simple, something real. You can stay, he said quietly, not as permission, not as an offer, but as a statement that matched what had already been decided. Ayanna watched him for a moment, then nodded once. We already have, she replied, and there was no challenge in it, only truth. Ethan let out a slow breath, not relief, not exhaustion, just release. He moved to the window and looked out across the land, now still, under the night sky, the same land he had ridden into hours ago thinking it was empty, thinking it was his, and now he understood, not fully, not completely, but enough. This place had never been waiting to be owned. It had been waiting to be stood on, to be seen for what it carried, not what it was sold as, and in that quiet realization, he did not feel like he had lost anything. He felt like he had finally arrived somewhere that did not need him to claim it, only to remain, and outside. The wind moved gently across the ground, carrying nothing away, only passing through, like it always had, like it always would. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came slowly, light stretching across the land in thin lines that touched the broken fence, the dry ground, the edges of the house that had held so much without saying a word. Ethan stepped outside before the sun cleared the horizon, the air cool, carrying the faint scent of dust, and something else, something steadier, something that had remained through the night. He stood on the porch for a moment, not moving, just looking. The yard was empty again, no riders, no tracks that told a clear story, only faint marks in the dirt that could have belonged to anyone. or no one at all. The kind of traces that do not prove anything, but still mean something to those who know how to read them. He stepped down slowly, boots pressing into the ground that now felt different under him. Not owned, not claimed, just held. He walked a few steps, out into the yard, stopping where they had all stood the night before, where hands had touched the earth without leaving a mark anyone else would notice. He looked down at that spot, then out toward the horizon, the same horizon that had carried men here with different intentions, and then carried them away without taking anything with them. Not the child, not the place, not the moment. Behind him, the door opened quietly, not with hesitation, just with presence. Ayana stepped out into the morning light, the child in her arms, wrapped now in cloth that caught the sun in a softer way. She stood beside him, not asking for space, not needing to be acknowledged, just there, as much a part of the land as the fence or the wind or the house itself. Ethan did not turn right away. He kept his eyes forward, watching as the light reached further across the ground. "They will come again," he said after a moment, his voice calm, not heavy. Ayana nodded. "Yes," she answered. There was no concern in it, no urgency, just understanding. Ethan let that settle, then asked quietly, "And when they do?" He paused, choosing the words not carefully, but honestly. "What changes?" Ayana shifted the child slightly, her gaze moving across the land, then back to him. "Only what they bring with them," she said, "not what is already here." Ethan nodded once, the answer simple, but complete. He looked down at the child then, for the first time in the morning light, really looking, the small rise and fall of breath, the quiet presence that had drawn so many men to this place without ever asking for it. "Tawa," Ethan said softly, testing the name again. Ayana's expression softened just a fraction. "He will walk this land," she said, "not because it belongs to him, but because he belongs to it." The words did not claim anything. They did not declare. They simply placed the truth where it could not be moved. Ethan took a slow breath, the air filling his chest with something that did not feel like ownership or duty, but something quieter, something steadier. He looked back toward the house, the worn wood, the leaning frame, the marks of time that had not been hidden or repaired. And for the first time, he did not see something broken. He saw something that had endured, something that had held its place without needing to be fixed. The other women stepped out then, not all at once, but one by one, moving into the light with the same quiet certainty they had held through the night. No longer hidden, no longer uncertain, just present, part of the space, part of what remained. Ethan turned slightly, taking them in, not as strangers now, not as something unexpected, but as something that had always been here, even before he arrived, even before he knew what he had walked into. The wind moved across the land again, softer in the morning, carrying nothing but itself. No riders, no urgency, just the steady rhythm of something that continues whether men understand it or not. Ethan stepped forward one more pace, then stopped, his boots settling into the dirt that no longer felt like something to cross, but something to stand on. He did not speak again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because nothing needed to be said. The choice had already been made, not in the night, not in the words, but in the way he had remained when he could have stepped aside, in the way the others had stood when they could have taken, in the way the land had held all of it without asking for anything in return. Ayana turned slightly, the child resting quietly against her, her voice low, almost carried away by the wind. "Out here," she said, "nothing is empty." Ethan let the words settle, then gave the faintest nod, not in agreement, not in realization, but in acceptance, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. And as the sun rose fully over the land, casting light across everything that had been there all along, the house, the ground, the people, the space between them, it became clear in a way that did not need explanation. What had happened here was not a story of something taken or something given. It was a moment where men chose to stay when leaving would have been easier, and in that quiet choice, something that had been waiting finally found its place, not in words, not in ownership, but in the simple act of standing and not moving when it mattered most.